Good morning. As I can see, we have crowds from all around the globe in all time zones. Briefly, the webinar's duration will be 40 minutes and will be recorded and then posted on VALOORES website for those who couldn't attend or wishing to revisit today's topic. For anyone who is willing to submit questions, please click on the below button of Q&As, and I will relay your questions to our panelists at the end of the webinar. And for the questions not answered due to the lack of time, we will secure sending the replies through emails. I am Joelle Sikkar, a senior business consultant at VALOORES, and I'll be the moderator between our speakers, Sarkis Mazraani and Bert Rai. So it's a pleasure to have you among us today in this digital ID compliance webinar. Our first speaker for today is Sarkis Mazraani, who is certified from ACAMS, experienced in combating the finance of terrorism, fraud investigation, and resilience. He is an international conferences speaker and facilitator. And Bert Rai, who brings around 20 years of professional experience in compliance, AML, and BI, in addition to extensive knowledge in banking, national and international authorities, rules, and regulations. Now, VALOORES, 30 years in 30 seconds, founded in France and now operating all around the globe, VALOORES delivers to multiple lines of business, and to name a few: banking, insurance, retail, digital government, multimedia, and healthcare. So VALOORES empowers decision-making, helping people and businesses to reach their ultimate targets. When it comes to financial services, VALOORES is a pioneer in master data governance, which is the foundation of its solutions, and dynamic tiered KYC, GRC, regulatory compliance, AML, sanction filtering, transaction monitoring and surveillance, and enterprise risk management. In addition to the predictive analytics and machine learning solution, and all that to improve our customers' ongoing operations, executions, and decisions. Now, a word on VALOORES Business Academy. It accelerates transformation by unlocking the potential of people to engender innovation, productivity, and growth. VALOORES Business Academy understands each organization's context, goals, and challenges, and crafts targeted programs that are directly linked to the drivers of value. We have more than a decade of experience in designing and deploying learning programs catered by a network of consultants and capability centers around the globe, with webinars and courses carefully designed by subject matter experts. So now I will hand over to Bert to go through our main topic for today, which is the digital ID compliance under FATF recommendations. So the floor is yours, Bert.
Good day all, and we are glad to have you among us. Today, our discussion will be focusing on the following 4 topics. First of all, we will start with a compliant digital ID. Why and why now we are talking about digital ID. Then we will go to the implementation and leverage. In addition to how to have the customer identification and some potential transactions of high risk, taking into consideration the CDD requirements and all the data protection concerns. Moving forward, to start, in any financial transaction, knowing your customer is essential to ensure that the funds involved are not linked with crime and terrorism. However, in a digital context, traditional verification tools that we are using do not apply. Again, why digital ID? This new transformation was due to many factors. I will list some of them. We have the new markets and international growth, expanding products and service operations, for sure anticipating future regulatory changes, and upgrading onboarding competitive. The FATF financial institution, virtual asset service providers, and other regulated entities determine whether a digital ID is appropriate for use for customer due diligence, the CDD. Reliable digital ID can make it easier and more secure to identify individuals in the financial sector. It can also help with transaction monitoring requirements and to minimize weaknesses in human control measures. Digital ID systems are evolving rapidly. Digital ID assurance frameworks and standards provide a risk mitigation framework and help the private sector and governments to determine the level of confidence and assurance a digital ID system provides. Moving forward, next please. Okay. Digital ID systems may use digital technologies in various ways. For example, but not limited to, technologies are electronic databases to obtain, confirm, store, and manage identity evidence. We can use the digital credentials to authenticate identity when accessing mobile, online, or offline applications. Moreover, we have the biometrics to help identify and authenticate individuals. Then we may use digital application program interfaces, platforms, and protocols to facilitate online verification and authentication of identity. To determine whether a digital ID is suitable, governments, financial institutions, and other stakeholders should take into consideration and understand the assurance levels of the digital ID system, technology, architecture, and governance. Given its assurance levels, the stakeholders should determine whether it is appropriately reliable, independent in light of potential risk that it is used to facilitate illicit finance. With 1.7 billion unbanked adults worldwide, and 26% of them citing lack of documentation as the primary barrier, digital ID offers another important benefit. A robust digital ID can allow individuals without a traditional identification to nonetheless have a sound form of identification to access financial services and improve financial inclusion. Not all elements of a digital ID system are necessarily digital. Some elements of identity proofing and enrollment components can be either digital or physical or a combination, but binding, credentialing, authentication, and portability must be digital. The floor is again yours, dear Joelle.
Thank you, Bert. Now we will discover with Sarkis the digital ID compliance timing, the implementation, and the leverage to financial inclusion. Please, Sarkis.
Compliant digital ID. Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Bert. Year to year, digitization is increasing in the financial world, 13% growth. And by year 2022, expected that digitization is the making of 60% of the globe finance. Hence, digitization is becoming a must. It is no more avoidable. So in order to survive into this international system, international financial system, institutions are supposed to do the digitization. And this digitization is supposed to be done upon the international standards, Wolfsburg, OECD, FATF, Security Council. Nowadays, USA and the European Union integrated into their systems, into their law, digitization. It is already there into the system. And all other countries are following and trying to integrate digitization into the law and the systems. At the same time, and speaking from compliance angle and from compliance perspective, digitization can be applied, and at the same time, we can have a robust anti-financial crime, anti-money laundering, combating finance of terrorism, avoiding fraud, avoiding cybercrime, and all of this can be done. Definitely this will lead to avoid the sanctions and avoid any kind of fines. Now, regarding recommendation 10 of FATF, now we're going to see a schema. What is required by this recommendation 10 of FATF regarding the digitization or the digital ID? If in case the country where the law is catering the digital ID into it and the digital ID is integrated into the law, then the financial institution is sufficient for it to apply the law, and then it is well positioned and it is compliant. If it is still not into the law, then financial institutions are supposed to refer to licensed audit firms, and these audit firms will assure that digitization is compliant. In case both scenarios are not there, in case it is not into the law and the audit firm is not available or cannot afford the service, then the financial institutions has to stick to the documentation in integrating new clients into their systems. Forward, FATF regulations are done and are given for the regulated institutions, that is financial institutions, that is gatekeepers such as notary and accountants. Now, if the high technology, the digital ID systems that meet the high technology and they meet also the organizational government standards, they can, and I put underline into this, they can give great promise for improving the trustworthiness and security and the privacy. And let me say, also, they can give assurance for transaction monitoring and scrutiny of transaction. And let's go into memory for what happened in France at Société Générale in 2008, when Jérôme Kerviel was convicted because of the unauthorized use of the computer, and which led to a loss of 4.9 billion euros. So with digital ID, with high technology, this incident would have never happened. Forward, the digital ID is sometimes being complained that it might let the business lose potential clients because it requires a lot of requirements that might bother the clients. However, here it is a proof where we see that digital ID is integrating 1.7 billion of non-bank clients into the economy. So we see that compliance is leading to economic growth, and it is leading to economic prosperity, and this is being legal and compliant upon the standards. Forward, definitely speaking about digital ID, there is a risk. And speaking about anti-money laundering under the umbrella of compliance, there are a huge number of scenarios where there can be money laundering. One of these scenarios is the cash mule. In our case, there is also a scenario to do money laundering, which is the digital ID mule. However, if preventive measures are there, which is the standards required by the high technology digital ID, such as OTP, distributed ledger, API biometric from one side, from the other side, a good transaction monitoring, in such a case, this risk is being mitigated. Now, moving forward, also speaking risk, in terms of risk-based approach, the non-face-to-face, which is a client, which is definitely, this is the case in the digital ID because the client is going to access the system through a non-face-to-face penetration. In such a case, it is considered high risk. Let's say regarding the KYC, the due diligence, the customer identification, the transaction monitoring, even though if we rely to an independent digital ID system with high technology from one side and with appropriate risk mitigation measure from the other side, then this represents that we are moving this high risk component to a standard level of risk, and this even may lower the risk of the digital ID. Now I leave the floor for you, Joël.
Thank you, Sarkis. Now, Bert, if you can elaborate more on the non-face-to-face customer identification process as per FATF recommendations.
Some example of a KYC onboarding application using a digital ID. We can have the collection, present and collect identity attributes and evidence, either in person or online. For example, by filling out an online form, sending a selfie photo, uploading photos of documents such as passport or driver license or any authorized document for proofing. Validation, digital or physical inspection to ensure the document is authentic and its data or information is accurate. For example, checking physical security features, expiration dates, passport number, and verifying attributes via other services. The third measurement is deduplication to establish that the identity attributes and evidence relate to a unique person in the ID system. Example, via duplicate record searches, biometric recognition, and/or deduplication algorithms in the market. The fourth point is verification. Link the individual to the identity evidence provided using biometric solutions like face recognition or voice recognition and liveness detection. The fifth point is enrollment in identity account and binding. We have to create the identity account, issue and link one or more authenticators with the identity account. For example, issuing passwords on the one-time code OTC generator on smartphones, passphrases, or we can have challenge questions to make sure this is the client and we are working with. Again, I will leave the floor for you, Joël.
Okay, Bert, we will close with Sarkis, who will inform us how to ensure the compatibility of AML-CFT requirements on digital ID systems with data protection.
Speaking data protection, let me refresh our memory and let me say Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook. It was an incident, there has been an incident about data protection. It is about IT security. It is about cyber security, cyber resilience. It is about GDPR. So under FATF recommendation 2, which requires every country should have the FIU entity. So the name might differ. For example, in the United States, the name is FinCEN, but the importance is the role of this entity. And it is an implication that if every country, by the recommendation 2 of FATF, should have this FIU entity. This FIU entity has the ownership to assure that all systems have the necessary data protection, the necessary IT security. And as we see and as we follow the news of the compliance, this is being a burning and hot topic and requirement and target for all governments and for all countries to reach the required high-level standards of this data protection. And I see myself that we are on the right track. So I leave it to you, Joel.
Thank you, Sarkis. Thank you, Bert. Always a pleasure discussing with you such crucial subjects. So, as a summary on all the avenues you brought up today, Valores secures servicing the digital ID initiatives, catering for the end-to-end digital transformation. Valores digital ID services will facilitate customer identification and verification at onboarding, support ongoing due diligence and scrutiny of transactions throughout the course of the business relationship, facilitate other customer due diligence measures, and aid transaction monitoring for the purposes of detecting and reporting suspicious transactions, as well as general risk management and anti-fraud efforts. So you have the values, we bring you the added values. It's Valores. So now switching to your questions, dear guests, and I can see lots of interesting ones. I will try as much as I can to select few random questions, and the remaining will be answered one by one and sent to your business emails. I can see questions about security and implementation, financial inclusion, impact of digital ID on government. So let's start with this question. I think this question belongs to Bert. You mentioned financial inclusion based on your implementation experience. How anti-money laundering would be managed with such limited KYC information?
Okay, thank you, Joel. You are talking about the financial inclusion with the KYC information we are having through a digital ID, right?
Yes, such limited KYC information, exactly.
Yes. So the financial service industry is witnessing now significant growth in the use of machine learning and advanced analytics as a result of improvements in artificial intelligence, where machine gets smarter by analyzing and learning from large data sets. So we will make use of that with big data, cloud computing, and processing speeds. We can have all these using the AI to spot non-standard illicit financing behavioral patterns, compliance, anti-money laundering, and examining financial transactions to prevent and detect irregular issues.
Okay, thank you, Bert. Here's another question. I will address it to Sarkis. How would you approach security in such implementations? Or I think digital ID implementation?
Well, let me reiterate the question. You're asking about the implementation of the IT security in the dimension of the digital ID implementation.
Yes.
Okay, effectively, let us go to the basics. It's simple. The question is, to whom shall we give access? On what data shall we give access? And who is authorized to be granted the access? Simple, let us go to the basics which are imposed by the law, which are imposed by the international systems. So institutions are supposed to apply these basics, these requirements, these international requirements in terms of security, and our systems will be in a robust situation in order to protect the data and have an efficient IT security.
Okay, thank you, Sarkis. Another question around the regulations. Bert, how do you think the digital ID impacts the regulatory compliance reporting?
Okay, thank you, Joelle. Regarding the regulatory compliance reporting and using digital ID. So some of the regulatory compliance reporting schemas collect data around customers' behaviors against financial obligations reliably, linking all records collected. They have collected from different institutions to that relevant customer. So here we have a full need to uniquely identify that individual or the legal entity, and to use this unique identifier to organize all records in the database. Here we can have the one single version of the truth related to the digital ID of that customer.
Okay, thank you, Bert. Due to time limitation, I will take 2 more questions and the rest will be answered, as I have mentioned before, one by one to your business emails. I will relay this question to Sarkis. You mentioned the FATF recommendations to governments. When would you expect to have regulations come out around the digital ID? And how do you see the impact of digital ID on government to person payments, the G2P? Wow, interesting one.
Okay, you're asking Joel about the FATF requirements about the digital ID, when government are going to apply them and integrate into their systems, and what will be their implications on the daily and the culture of each country, let me say it.
Yes.
Effectively, nowadays it is well known, every country to stay in the international orchestra of financial system, it has to meet the FATF requirements, and full stop. So in such a case, every country now, if it did not yet sign or issued a law for anti-money laundering, it is now issued. So most of the countries did issue this law. Every country having this law for anti-money laundering, finance of terrorism, they have to apply the FATF requirements. And FATF did launch and require the implementation of the digital ID. Therefore, and this is why I tell you, and we all know that FATF assessment is being done for all countries. It's on for all countries, and all countries want to have a good FATF assessment. So it is going to be applied soon and integrated by government into all systems, all countries. And as we already mentioned, that many countries, especially US and European countries, already did. I see it very soon in all countries.
Well, hope so. Thank you, Sarkis, and hope we answered this question at the level or at the expectations. So the final question for Bert, since she previously brought up this subject, how do you assess the authentication process of the digital ID, Bert?
Okay. As a digital ID system evolves and authentication is active and continuous, authentication strength is sometimes assessed not in terms of the number of different authentication factors or types we already mentioned above, but in terms of an overall robustness resulting from the use of multiple sources of dynamic digital customer data. So we can have some examples as login channels, the geolocation, the frequency of usage, the IP addresses, and biomechanical matrix behavioral patterns.
Okay, thank you, Bert. So thank you again. Thank you again for joining us today. And thank you for our panelists. And stay tuned for future Valores webinars with Valores Business Academy. Have a nice day.